Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Jane Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art and Nature Center and Curator of Natural History at PAM and Vice President of ECOC and Program Coordinator. So we're very happy to be welcoming you all here for this co-hosted event between PAM and ECOC. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Tina Morris and her talk, Return to the Sky, How One Woman Helped Restore the Bald Eagle. Her talk feels particularly timely as the bald eagle was recently just designated as our national bird in December 2024. After some twists and turns along the way, Tina earned her undergraduate degree from Oberlin College in 1972. Then in 1976, as the bald eagle, our national symbol since 1782, was facing extinction in the continental US, she was beginning her graduate work at Cornell University. By luck and circumstance, Tina was selected to reintroduce the species in New York State in the hope that eagles could repopulate Eastern North America. Her experience during that fateful time is the focus of her talk tonight. She completed her graduate work in ornithology and wildlife biology at Cornell in 1978, writing her thesis on the adaptations of hacking techniques to reintroduce bald eagles. Following her studies at Cornell, she worked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Nature Conservancy for several years, focusing on endangered species and critical habitat conservation, before embarking on a 23-year career teaching English and biology. Since her retirement in 2020, she has devoted her time to her own writing, especially creative nonfiction with a science or nature focus. Her short stories and nonfiction essays have appeared in Cognoscenti, Lit Break, Kestrel, and North by Northeast. Her critically acclaimed memoir, Return to the Sky, The Surprising Story of How One Woman and Seven Eaglets Helped Restore the Bald Eagle, was published just last October. And she has agreed to sign and personalize copies following her presentation tonight. Tina and her husband manage a farm here on the North Shore as a wildlife sanctuary, promoting biodiversity and habitat protection for species in decline. So I'm so delighted to be welcoming you, Tina, and I hope you will all join me in giving a warm welcome to Tina Morris.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Janie. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight, to see all of you from the Peabody Essex Museum and Essex County Ornithological Club, and to see your interest in the bald eagle. I'm going to be speaking to you about my book, Return to the Sky, the story of the bald eagles I was trying to save almost 50 years ago. Tonight, I will be focusing on those eagles and the project that brought them back to the Northeast. If you read the book, you can find out how my life was changed by the program. But for now, the seven eaglets will take center stage. And just like their spectacular relatives, they are, you see, flying up and down the Merrimack and along our coast throughout the months of January and February, they do this very well. And bear with me while I try to work two clickers at the same time. Okay. There is another reason why it is an honor to be here tonight. And Janie mentioned this in her introduction. On Christmas Eve, over 2 months ago, President Biden signed a bill designating the bald eagle as our national bird. Many of us, including me, thought he was already our national bird. But a dedicated supporter of the National Eagle Center in Wabasha, Minnesota, Preston Cook, discovered the government had never officially named him as such. With the help of Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, he was able to convince both houses of Congress, which is a feat unto itself, as we all know, to pass legislation which made it to the president's desk before he left office. We can now accurately refer to the eagle as the nation's bird and have Preston Cook to thank for this effort. We will appreciate that. The saga of the bald eagle's return was inextricably tied to that of the peregrine falcon. Without his smaller and faster friend to set the pace, the success of the Eagle project might not have been so auspicious. The raptor biologists who were instrumental in the reintroduction of the peregrine were also the guiding force behind the restoration of the eagle 3 years later. The story of the eagle, okay, here we go with the clickers. The story of the eagle and peregrine began in Ithaca in central New York State, home to Cornell University. Perched on the southern end of Cayuga Lake, one of the Finger Lakes, so named for their long and skinny shapes, Cornell was known for the world-renowned laboratory of ornithology. But by the 1970s, it had also become the epicenter of raptor reintroductions. We need to back up a decade, however, to the seminal event that started everything. In 1962, a marine biologist named Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, the book that sounded the alarm about the lethal effects of the pesticide DDT. At the time, few biologists paid attention to Carson, partly because of her doomsday predictions and partly because of her gender. Women were scarce in science at the time, which made it easy for the scientific community to dismiss her. It was her findings about DDT, a long-lasting pesticide used to combat malaria during World War II, that made Carson a main character in the bald eagle story. She discovered that DDT wasn't just killing the mosquitoes it was meant to control, but was breaking down into its metabolite, DDE, which was absorbed by the algae, fish, and other aquatic organisms consumed by birds. Once ingested, DDE interfered with the calcium metabolism of the bird's eggs, resulting in thinner eggshells and breakage when they tried to incubate them. Although all birds were being affected, it was the ones at the top of the food chain that were the most affected: ospreys, pelicans, and the bald eagle, who eat fish, and the peregrine falcon, who ate smaller birds, but which in turn were eating insects, seeds, and other food contaminated by the poison. Through a process called biomagnification, the pesticide was consumed by species at each trophic level. Its concentration increased with every step up the food chain until the final and top destination, the predators. Sadly, Rachel Carson died of cancer at the age of 56, only 2 years after her book was published. But her findings had been corroborated by scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey's Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. They found out the bird world was shocked by the truth that explained the decline of the many of their favorite species. Carson's cause was taken up by a group of people with personal interests in the raptors affected by DDT, particularly peregrine falcons. In 1965, led by a falconer named Joe Hickey, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, a conference was held in Madison to discuss the problem. At that meeting, the Raptor Research Foundation was born. The 1970s became the age of enlightenment as the federal government took up the cause of environmental degradation. Under Richard Nixon, whose administration, unbeknownst to many, had a strong commitment to the environment, legislation began to be passed to curb our decline. In 1970, Joe Hickey organized a second meeting in Madison, this time to call for the ban of DDT. In December of that year, the EPA was established as the watchdog for clean air and water. Although DDT wasn't officially banned until 1972, the race to save the birds was on. Preparing the stage further to restore species, the peregrine, like the peregrine and eagle, was the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, protecting not only the species, but also their habitat. Let me introduce the fathers of falconry. 3 men were instrumental in addressing the plight of peregrines. Tom Cade, a falconer and ornithology professor who was then teaching at Syracuse University, Heinz Meng, who was mastering the art of captive breeding of falcons at SUNY New Paltz, and of course, Joe Hickey. Although the falconry world was close-knit and everyone helped each other as they considered how to save the peregrine, it was Tom Cade who established the program that would bring it back. He moved from Syracuse to Cornell with the stipulation that he could house a captive breeding facility in Ithaca. Because there were no peregrines left in the Northeast, it was essential that there would be captive breeding of subspecies from other areas. Dr. Cade created a facility known to the Cornell community as the Hawk Barn, adjacent to the Lab of Ornithology. Here, the artificial insemination was mastered, although excited male falcons forced their handlers to wear some self-defense equipment like this modified helmet with a lip around it to catch the semen while protecting their heads. The peregrine program used hacking, a training technique borrowed from falconry, whereby young birds are raised and released without parents. Sometimes these young falcons can be bred in captivity, or sometimes they're taken from the wild at a young age. In the latter case, the birds have had a chance to imprint on their parents, so they know what they are, and as they mature, they can act as members of their species. The peregrine falcon program placed young falcons into hacking boxes, where they were fed and protected by humans, caretakers, who tried to stay away, out of sight as much as possible until the falcons were ready to feed and obviously learn to fly. The hack boxes were placed in areas that closely resembled the peregrine's natural habitat, like cliffs and ledges, towers, and later bridges, when the program was moved more into the cities to escape the predators like great horned owls and raccoons that preyed on the young falcons at night. The peregrine releases, begun in 1973, served as the model for the Bald Eagle Project. Having witnessed the success of the peregrine program, New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation foresaw the year 1976 as an ideal time to bring the eagle back from the brink of extinction. By then, DDT had decimated its populations in all states of the Northeast except for Maine, where there were only a few breeding pairs. Patriotic fever was running high, and nobody could imagine celebrating the bicentennial without what they believed to be their national bird. Funny how things change. After its ban in 1972, DDT levels detected in fish declined precipitously. By the mid-1970s, the bald eagle's former habitat had become clean enough to receive birds again. Although almost gone from the sky, the eagle's image was ubiquitous, appearing on our currency, on sports team logos. Of course, the Philadelphia Eagles even won the Super Bowl with the eagle logo on their helmets. And of course, on our national seal, despite Ben Franklin's disdain for the eagle, which he considered a bad moral character, supposedly because of its scavenger nature. The turkey and other contenders didn't stand a chance against the grandeur of the bald eagle when our forefathers were looking for a symbol of freedom, majesty, and power to represent the newly independent USA. By 1976, in the lower 48 states, eagles had been reduced to 417 pairs, a number much too low to sustain the species. According to the terms of the Endangered Species Act, the federal government had jurisdiction over the eagle, so New York needed permission from the Department of the Interior to launch a reintroduction program. DEC's proposal to release eagles was denied due to the fact that they didn't have any raptor biologists on staff who could lead the program. Enter Tom Cade and his young and inexperienced wannabe graduate student, me. I had arrived at Cornell to pursue my dream of working with Dr. Cade, but when he told me I needed a funded program to be accepted as a graduate student, my dream started to plummet. Then, by pure serendipity, I had a chance meeting with the two Fish and Wildlife administrators in Washington in charge of the defunct eagle proposal. And things took a sudden turn. They asked Dr. Cade to head the program for eagles due to his expertise with reintroducing peregrines. If I would be willing to work with the eagles, Dr. Cade said, he would be willing to supervise the project and the eagle program would be possible. A deal was made and the project began, officially in June of 1976, but the groundwork began to be formed in the previous fall. The first order of business was to find a suitable site in New York from which to reintroduce the birds. Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge near Seneca Falls at the northern end of Cayuga Lake was selected. Montezuma met all the requirements needed for a release site. Food would be plentiful in the 10,000-acre wetland complex that boasted marsh, rivers, and open water. The presence of a wide variety of water birds and fish guaranteed its food potential for young bald eagles as well as adults returning to breed. Protection of the young eagles was paramount, as so the release site had to be able to be cordoned off and made inaccessible to the public. Clark's Ridge, a hilltop overlooking Shockey Pool, the largest water body in the marsh, was hidden amidst a labyrinth of dirt roads that surrounded farmland around the refuge, making it impossible to locate it. Luckily, this was before the day of GPS and Google Maps. It was important that the site be near Cornell so that in case of emergency, and I needed the peregrine team, they could get to me quickly. The drive from Ithaca to the refuge took less than an hour. It was important that the site be, bald eagles prefer to nest in tall trees with strong branches, which the young use as practice perches when they're learning to fly. Nests are often built and the V's formed by these branches. The adults like to be able to see around them, so height and being on the edge of the forest is very important. Montezuma had many hardwoods surrounding the wetland area, perfect for future nests. Once the site was chosen, the next dilemma was finding a source for young eagles that could be transported to New York. Because there were no sustainable populations left in any of the surrounding states, it would be necessary to go further afield to find an area where DDT hadn't left its mark. Of course, Alaska had plenty of bald eagles, but the genetic makeup of this larger subspecies was thought at the time to not be worth taking a chance on. Instead, the program looked to the Midwest, particularly the Great Lakes states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, where DDT hadn't been used as it had in the Northeast, and which had a good, healthy population of bald eagles. Bald eagles generally lay 3 eggs and try to rear 3 young. However, because of food supply and energy expenditure, often the third eaglet is smaller and weaker than its siblings and doesn't make it. They are often thrown out of the nest or pushed aside by the older ones until they starve. Therefore, the plan was to select the third eaglet from one of these nests for transport. Since the climbers who scaled the nest sites to band the eagles at about 7 weeks of age, we left it up to them to decide which birds to remove. The position of the nest tower in the refuge was critical. Not only did it have to be hidden from the public, it had to be high enough for the young birds to survey the land around them, to be able to be near tall trees they could use as perches once they started to fly, and most of all, near the water. Clark's Ridge met all these criteria. The local electric company donated and installed 4 35-foot poles for the tower, on top of which we constructed a 7-foot platform. My peregrine team colleagues, Jim Weaver and Willard Heck, and I had to think like eagle parents and build a nest that was very similar to the one that they left in Wisconsin. One of the other things we had to do was to create a canvas blind or hide into which I could observe the birds next to the platform, but I could also feed them. They weren't supposed to see me, and that was very important to this whole operation. The blind was barely large enough for me to sit in cross-legged. On the slide facing the nest was a hole through which I could feed the birds using a long barbecue fork without having them see me, so they wouldn't view humans as their food providers or food source, a dangerous situation for both species. At first, I had to climb to the platform using metal pegs like those used by electric linemen. But once the scaffolding was up, my ascent became far easier and a lot less scary. We wrapped aluminum predator guards around the poles to prevent animals like raccoons from accessing the young, especially at night. The day finally came on June 18, 1976, when the Wisconsin Fish and Wildlife climbers called to say that they had 2 eaglets ready to ship to New York. Arriving at Syracuse Airport in 2 separate crates, the birds, known as W1 and W2, W for Wisconsin, 1 for female, 2 for male, were retrieved by federal officials and shipped to us, or driven to us, to the refuge an hour away. On hand to receive the eaglets was a large contingent of people, media, state, federal, and refuge people, a few biologists from Cornell, Tom Cade, and me and my 2 dogs, Max and Moses. While most of the entourage stood at the base of the tower looking up, Dr. Cade tied the ropes around the crates, Jim Weaver hauled them up to the top of the platform, and Dr. Cade and I then pried open the tops to release the birds. The eaglets had been shrieking while in the crates with their call-like cry until they were able to hop onto their new nest and seek shelter in the corner as far away from their captors as possible. These weren't cute, tame birds who wanted to be our friends, and for this we were very grateful. They had to have a healthy fear of humans if they were going to survive. After the eaglets settled down and the crowd dispersed, I was left alone on the hillside with my dogs, wondering how the eagles and I were going to survive the next 3 months. The first order of business was to set up my campsite, including my tent, my camp stove, and all the paraphernalia required for the birds. To observe the birds, even when I wasn't up in the blind, I had a remote video camera with a monitor in the tent. The picture was a bit fuzzy by modern standards, but at least I could see that they were okay. Speaking of more advanced technology, many of you may have been tuning in to the Big Bear Valley nest in California, where an eagle cam is focused on a pair, Jackie and Shadow, and their attempts to hatch 3 eggs after experiencing failure the last 2 years. As of today, and I think the 3rd one is finally out of the egg, but I may be speaking too soon, his head was up. 3 eaglets have hatched as over 75,000 viewers have looked on. The Eagle Cam has captured every magical moment, making you feel like you are sitting in the nest with the adult pair. It is quite an amazing show if you haven't seen it. The next order of business was to feed the young birds. The marshes were teeming with carp, but I had to catch them and stockpile them so that I'd have enough for 2 meals a day. In the first year, fish were plentiful, and I trapped them in a spillway. Then I would move them from the spillway into a large cage where I could net them whenever I needed them. The next year, however, we had a severe drought, and the carp were decimated. So I had to be very inventive and make friends with the local fishermen very quickly, who were able to restore my supply, and it worked very well. They were very kind. Eagles are opportunistic feeders, so although fish is a mainstay of their diet, they also eat mammals, small mammals mostly, and water birds, as well as scavenge for carrion. To give them a balanced diet and introduce them to the many delicacies that awaited them in the outside world, I had to find roadkill. I spent hours driving the roads around the refuge, picking up rabbits, squirrels, muskrats, woodchucks, snakes, and other tasty morsels. By the way, rabbits were the food of choice. I knew we had to be able to track the eaglets when they left the nest, so being able to band and equip them with radios became the next step before they fledged. Surveillance methods, especially for eagles, were in their infancy in 1976, so everything we did was trial and error. With Jim Weaver's help and lots of experimenting, we eventually worked out how to attach a short-term radio to the eagles and to put colored tags on their wings that could withstand the weather, but also could be seen from a distance. Because of their dependence on flight for hunting and migration, we had to be careful that the apparatuses didn't interfere with their wing movements. We ended up having to modify things between 1976 and 1977 as we began to see what worked and what didn't. My issue was going to be restraining the eaglets, especially when I had to handle them alone. For this, I experimented with several body wraps, but what worked best in the end, believe it or not, was my blue jeans. I cut off the leg, and the tapering shape was a perfect fit for an eagle. He couldn't move his wings, and with his talons wrapped with electrical tape and the cloth of the blue jeans over his beak, he was unable to reach my hands. He was safe and secure, as was I. After spending my days watching and recording the eaglets' behavior from the blind, I noticed a significant increase in their energy level. Increasingly more restless and energetic, they began hopping all over the platform, flapping their wings as they practiced their pre-flight maneuvers, and even banging their heads on the top of the platform of the enclosure as they gained altitude. It was finally time to remove the bars before they hurt themselves. And so I put them out on the perch, and we had nailed to the tower. Before long, they made their first flight. However, I had little time to enjoy their freedom, because as soon as they spread their wings for the first time, like all creatures, first steps are always a little shaky, and that includes flights. An eagle's size works against it when first taking off, so it looks like an out-of-control helicopter looking for a place to land. This usually was into the marsh, way below the platform, and so I had to find them. If they had been in the wild, the eagle parents would have found them, and they would have fed them on the ground and taken care of them and made sure that predators didn't catch them during the night. But there were no eagle parents, there was just me. So I had to catch them and return them to their nest on top of the tower, and basically give them a second try. Hauling a struggling eagle under one arm while gripping the ladder with the other arm was quite an interesting task. Eventually, they grew stronger and were able to reach a perch, either on one of the trees near the nest tower or the dead snags in the marsh. The 1976 eagles spent a few months exploring the areas inside and outside the refuge, learning how to catch their own food until hunting season came in October. Then they left the refuge for good, perhaps scared off by the hunters, leaving me to wonder if they would survive all the threats that were going to be awaiting them in the outside world. Once their radio batteries died in a period of weeks, there was no way to follow them, so all I could do was hope. In late winter and spring of 1977, we began to prepare for the next group of eagles. It had been decided to hack 4 birds this time. The scaffolding had to be removed so a second nest platform could be built in the middle of them, and a blind was placed between the 2 nests so I could observe and feed both sets of eagles. With the scaffolding gone, I was back to the metal pegs for climbing. Like a mountain goat, I would clamber up to the platform. Now, I find it hard to believe that I ever did this, but I did. Push aside the plywood door to my blind and haul myself up into the blind itself, all while trying not to make any noise that could possibly disturb the birds. In one of these photos, you can see my blue jean cutoff shorts, whose legs were now in use as the sleeves to restrain the eagles. In 1977, 2 of our eaglets were taken from 3 bird nests, one from Michigan, M1, and one from Minnesota, M2. But we also wanted to use captive bred birds this time around. Patuxent Wildlife Research Center offered us 2 eaglets raised by eagle parents at the facility held in captivity there. There turned out to be a huge difference between captive bred eagles and wild eagles, partly because of size and maturity of the caged birds. They had been fed an unlimited diet when they were at Patuxent. They'd been around people a lot, and they were very feisty. So their precociousness made them quite interesting to take care of. They had no desire whatsoever to be contained behind bars and went out to the perch early after arriving. Sometimes they even hopped onto the roof so that they could get a better view. The video camera had been moved to a pole next to the nest tower so it could capture both nests at the same time and record it back to the monitor that was in my trailer that had taken place of my tent from the previous year. In July, a game of musical chairs was in order, as all 4 eaglets were still confined in their nests when I was told I would be welcoming a new arrival. A 3rd eaglet with a broken leg had been discovered and rescued by the climbers in Michigan when they were securing our eaglet M1. The injured bird, whom I called M3, was sent to the vet college of the University of Minnesota to be treated and rehabbed. He was now ready to be released and was on his way to me. Since the 2 Patuxent birds and M1, the female from Michigan, were now ready to fledge, I opened the bars on one cage so they could come and go. In the other cage, I put M3 and M2, the male from Minnesota, in together. We will hear about M3 later in this talk, but suffice to say he was the calmest and most endearing of all the eagles that I released. The secrecy surrounding the Eagle Project was well kept during the first year. Everyone was worried about the vandalism if the public knew the eagles were on the ridge. And there was a little bit of worry about me being by myself in the middle of nowhere with my 2 dogs for protection. There was also uncertainty about whether the program was going to succeed. The government did not want it advertised until they were sure that the eagles would survive long enough to leave the refuge. However, in 1977, there was no such secrecy, and I was besieged by media anxious for a juicy story. Reporters would come for an interview armed with their cameras, and I would find a simple snapshot, luring readers to a front-page article in the New York Times all about the birds and their young female caretaker. My camera-shy nature was not well suited to this new role I was playing. Some of the notoriety was welcome, however. In the fall of 1977, I was invited to attend the New York State Fair in Syracuse to be inducted into the Iroquois Confederacy as an honorary member of the Iroquois Nation. Although I was nervous about going, it was a memory I will savor forever. I spent the day with members of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, learned about their customs and culture, received an Iroquois name, Yenunde, which means she who feeds, quite appropriate for what I was doing most of the time. And I was lavished with handmade gifts from each group, including a sacred eagle feather. Apparently, I was the first female to receive such an honor, allowing the wives of the chiefs to be part of the event, an historic moment for them as well. After the eagles left the refuge in the fall of 1977, my tenure as the eagle caretaker was over. Although I never saw these eaglets catch their own food, they seemed to be independent and had stopped coming back to the tower for the fish that I was leaving them, a sign that they were finding better options somewhere else. I returned to Ithaca and completed my thesis, which ended up becoming the manual on hacking bald eagles. By the 1980s, sorry, I didn't mean to switch that quite so fast. By the 1980s, 9 other states had adopted our hacking procedures and were releasing eagles. Massachusetts hacked 41 birds from 1982 to 1988 at Quabbin Reservoir. The last state to do so was Tennessee, which hacked, not hijacked, hacked birds until 2020, exceeding even New York's total of 198. New York continued to hack eagles in Montezuma from 78 to 81. Deciding eventually to move the project to other sites within the state to allow the breeding birds to return to their natal area without becoming overcrowded. As it turns out, what we now know is that eagles aren't as averse to nesting near each other as we once thought, as long as there is an ample food supply, which explains today's existence of 28 active eagle nests within a 25-mile radius of Montezuma. As the hacking projects increased, the states had to reach further afield to find healthy eaglets for transport. While New York was using Alaskan birds by then, having decided that the genetic problem wasn't going to be a big one, other states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey connected with Saskatchewan and other Canadian provinces. Massachusetts brought its eagles from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This cross-border cooperation between our 2 countries allowed eagles to return to the skies of the northeastern U.S. Looking at New England and New York, we can see the dramatic increase in breeding eagle pairs since 1967, when DDT was still a threat. Only Maine had breeding pairs, and just 21 at the time. By 2023, Maine still won the prize with over 800 pairs, with New York a close second with 426. Note Massachusetts' success rate going from 0 in the early 1980s, to more than 90 pairs by 2023. Circling back to Montezuma for a minute and the 7 eaglets I had raised back in 1976 and 1977, my Wisconsin eaglets, W1 and W2, turned out to be siblings taken from the same nest. We're not quite sure what happened on the top of that tree when the climber went to get one sibling, but apparently there was a reason why he took 2. It may have been that they both needed help, or it could have been weather was coming in and he was afraid he couldn't make a second climb. We'll never know. But the bond of the brother and sister never wavered after they left the refuge, and they went on to mate and nest near Watertown, a couple of hours away, raising 1 eaglet in 1980. But the most exciting news was that of M3, the rehabbed eagle from Michigan. I had lost track of him along with the other eagles that year and could only hope they had survived. In June 2015, I received a press release from the DEC of New York that his body had been recovered, the victim of a vehicle hit. He had a band on his leg that identified him as one of my eagles. He was 38 years old, the oldest wild eagle ever known. And he had been nesting in Hemlock Lake, the last remaining eagle nest, when the project was begun. Breeding for 35 years with 2 different mates, he probably had as many as 70 eagles during his lifetime. I was indeed a proud mama. 2 other eagles hacked by DEC later on had also been identified as part of the famous trio, a family of 2 males and 1 female who returned to the refuge in 1987. New York's goal was to put 10 breeding pairs back into the skies. And you can see by these maps of nesting territories taken every 10 years that shows how successful eagles became at surpassing that goal. The population trend in Massachusetts shown here was a microcosm of what was happening in the other 48 states. Between the success of the hacking projects and the distribution patterns of bald eagles as they spread out and established new territories, the experience of the species mushroomed between 1987 and 2023. Today in the continental US, eagles are most numerous in the Midwest and along the Atlantic Flyway. Minnesota has the 2nd largest population, Florida the 3rd, next to Alaska, that wins the prize with boasts about half of the total bald eagle breeding population. The timeline of the bald eagle's recovery is defined by several key pieces of legislation and moments in the U.S. history of conservation, beginning in 1940 with the Bald Eagle Protection Act. By 2007, the eagle had recovered enough to be removed from the endangered species list, although states like Tennessee were still hacking them 13 years later. After 1977, I never returned to Montezuma, although I passed it on the thruway and always craned my neck searching for the tower on Clark's Ridge. I followed the news about the hacked eagles as much as I could, but when Dr. Cade moved the Peregrine Fund to Boise, Idaho to merge it with the World Center for Birds of Prey, my source of information was gone. Tom Cade died in 2019. By 2020, I knew I had to write the story about the origins of this project, and it needed to be told. I knew this meant returning to the marshes to see the eagles again. In November 2022, my husband Larry and I were shocked when we drove into the refuge. When I had left almost 45 years before, there were no breeding eagles and little sign that the species would become the signature species of the refuge. Now we passed many images of eagles welcoming visitors. After I convinced the current refuge staff that I had been the one to start the Eagle Project, thanks to the expertise of the Cornell Peregrine team and Tom Cade, I was given the keys to the city, or the refuge as it were. I was shown the giant sculpture designed by Jay Seaman to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the reintroduction, which sits on the edge of the refuge adjacent to the New York Thruway. Many of you have probably traveled that road, and depending on whether you're going east or west, have seen that statue. It's pretty amazing. Accompanied by our Montezuma guides, we bushwhacked our way up to Clark's Ridge, long overgrown, but still the home of the Nest Tower, albeit a bit bedraggled all these years later. Even the box holding the video camera was still intact. I went down memory lane with my patient listeners as they had to hear me drone on about the program, the start of the Eagle recovery, and the role Cornell had played in the project. Today, 7 bald eagle nests are active in the refuge, with 9 more in the wetlands complex surrounding the boundaries. Some pairs even build 2 nests, supposedly as insurance against disaster, but I think they're so secure and comfortable that they actually want a winter and a summer house. As we stood on the dike road that runs along Shockey Pool, where I had once rescued so many youngsters from the cattails, adult and immature eagles were flying all around us. Here, I would like to take a moment to share what was racing through my mind at that time by reading a short passage from the book about this experience. Rafts of wintering ducks and Canada geese rest on the river's flotsam. Barely visible against late autumn's platinum sky flies a dark bird with wings outstretched in a perfect plane. Finger-like wingtips, the absence of flapping, and the nearly 7-foot wingspan stops my breath as I recognize the adult eagle bearing down on the flock, then veering upwards with jet-like precision at the last moment, heading towards the woods behind where we are standing. Brave souls, these waterfowl, never flinching. How do they know the raptor is playing with them and not hungry for a duck dinner? A common sight for the other observers standing with me, fortunate to be out here every day. The only gasp comes from me, one of many I will utter during this visit. Several more eagles fly over my head towards a group of red maples, hugging the tributaries. Adults land on tree limbs overhanging the dike road, while the immatures, 6 altogether, with their uniforms of chocolate brown from head to toe, perch like preschoolers in one of 2 adjacent trees. I want to call the class to order, to watch and listen and tell them where they have come from and what it means for them to be here on this day. I want to tell them about their grandparents, those stalwart 7 eagles, and the others who followed them, whose resilience and persistence paved the way for their return to this refuge nearly 50 years ago. I want to stand there alone with my birds until they can grasp their own significance. I have returned to a planet long abandoned, not quite foreign, yet existing in shadow, marked by cloudy images tapping gently on my memory. The red maple snags where my eaglets once perched to learn about the world around them no longer dot the marsh. Only cattails remain, and even these have been beheaded by wind and water. The once tall grasses form endless greenish-brown clumps beyond the open channel, reaching to where a hillside begins to rise above the marsh. The water is high, the current swift. It would be impossible to cross to the field of cattails in the distance without a boat. It would be at least chest high and require waders to navigate it. But I know it is possible. In this mass of vegetation, interspersed with standing pools of water, invisible from the outside world, had once been 7 hapless eaglets, each rescued from certain disaster by a young researcher, so desperate to reach her quarry, she didn't notice how deep the water was, how thick the grasses were, how many times she'd have to fall into the cavities below her. Had that really happened, surely the river today must be wider, deeper, the Erie Canal forcing manipulation of the water levels over the years. As I begin to question my memories, seeking clarification at every step of my mind travel, I look up at the hillside. My hillside. Nothing but trees can be seen from down here on the dike road, but wait, there is a shadow behind the tallest ones, a bare silhouette of telephone poles, straighter and darker than trees. Something is there, but I can't be sure. Although my heart is gladdened by the sight of so many bald eagles today, I know that their success and increased numbers haven't been without criticism. Many people don't like having predators in their midst, or don't understand that an ecosystem is most healthy when all trophic levels are full and balanced. An apex predator like a bald eagle can have enemies among humans who find it hard to watch him take a fish from an osprey, or attack its chicks, or take over its platform, or go after the loons and herons who are nesting in their pond. Making room for all species is not something we humans do easily. Instead, we pick sides, and often the underdog becomes our cause. We have forgotten that almost 50 years ago, the bald eagle was the underdog, and only with our help and vigilance was saved from extinction. I hope we can learn to champion his comeback, to be tolerant when he behaves according to his true nature, and to ensure the threats that still exist in his world are mitigated so as not to repeat the damage of DDT. And there are significant threats to the eagle we have to be concerned about. Lead poisoning results from lead shot used by hunters that drops into the mud of streams, lakes, and rivers, or is inside the carcasses of waterfowl or deer that are taken by the eagles for dinner. It can also come from lead sinkers used in fishing. Lead wreaks havoc on an eagle's nervous and digestive systems, causing him to lose weight and eventually die. Shooting continues to be an issue, as do vehicle deaths. M3 was testament to this. The eagles are scavengers, so a roadkill or carcass on train tracks are too enticing for a hungry eagle to avoid who wants dinner and wants to come down to eat. AVM, or avian vacuolar myelinopathy, is caused by a toxin, cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, that transfers to eagles through water birds like coots. Wind farms, although a positive resource to counter our use of fossil fuels, can also take out eagles who are learning to fly when they are built too near their nest sites. As we know, immatures are not coordinated enough to avoid the giant blades when they are trying to take to the air. Other threats, like rodenticides, used by homeowners and farmers and lethal to eagles who ingest the targeted rodents, unwittingly looking for an easy meal. And I hope you will get some information as you leave here tonight on the program to try to curb the use of rodenticides in our towns and cities. The more insidious threats of habitat loss, which often reduces nest sites by logging or thinning of tall trees or developing lake shores or rivers, and of course climate change, which affects the food supply that the eagles depend on. And our latest and perhaps most serious worry, avian flu, which has taken its toll on many eagles, especially in coastal states like Florida and Georgia, where eagles eat water birds infected with the disease, but also in former eagle strongholds like Michigan and Minnesota. It is believed that this virus killed 600 eagles in 45 states in the last few years. Migrating flocks of snow geese visit Massachusetts in the winter on their way south from their breeding grounds in Canada and Greenland. Usually they follow the Atlantic Flyway down the Connecticut River Valley west of here, along the Hudson River in New York, and then through Pennsylvania on their way south. This year, 5,000 geese succumbed to the avian flu in eastern Pennsylvania, and 1,000 were found dead in New York. Alarmingly, snow geese are a favorite prey item of bald eagles. This bird is too majestic to be ignored again, but as we have seen with many less charismatic birds, if we take our eye off the ball, we lose the brilliant biodiversity that we need to make our planet survive. The Bald Eagle Project was a success, the recovery extraordinary, and the lessons we learned should be enduring. We humans owe a debt to the natural world around us. We need to respect it, conserve it, and be mindful of its future. I hope you can read Return to the Sky if you haven't already done so, but most important, that you are able to enjoy the many bald eagles who have made Massachusetts their home. Today, we can revel in the numbers of wintering birds who visit the Merrimack River, as well as the many nests that you can find dotted around the state during their breeding season. Thank you all for listening tonight, and I am happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Tina, first, thank you so much for the presentation and also just an incredibly brave and determined young woman that you must have been to do that work. And I'd love to ask a question just before passing it on, because your book does, like in the reading, you can tell there's such a personal experience. You know, you bring us into that experience. And I
Right.
was just curious if you wanted to speak a little about, like, were there moments during that time you were out in the field by yourself where you felt like, what am I doing here?
Many. There were many moments like that. Yes, I ask myself that question almost daily. The biggest problem that I had was the pressure of trying to save the national bird. If I'd known he wasn't the national bird, then I might have felt different. But no, it was a scary time, and we really had no idea whether this was going to work. It was really seat of the pants kind of field biology going on, and I had to make a lot of decisions that I did not feel like I was completely capable of making, but somehow we muscled through, and the Eagles helped me along. But yes, there were a lot of times when I wondered, what on earth am I doing here? But I'm glad I did it.
It paid off. It paid
It
off.
paid off.
Your
Yeah.
so some questions, and Leela and I both have mics, so.
What is hacking an eaglet?
Okay, so hacking
Catching
is a
it?
falconry term, and it's basically taking a young bird and raising it without its parents until it's finally able to fly and then eventually find food on its own. And it's done very differently by falconers than what I was doing, because they're actually trying to train the bird to come back to them and hunt for them. So it gets a little complicated, but that's basically what it is.
When you were having the dogs with you in the area, were they able to help you track the missing fledglings down in the marsh, or were they too aggressive towards the birds generally when you had your dogs with you?
I'm sorry, I can't, I'm not sure I got all of that question. Can you repeat it?
When you were in the marsh
Yeah.
looking for the young birds who had fallen or fallen down while they were trying to fly,
Right.
were your dogs able to help you track them down, or? Okay. Didn't think so.
No, the dogs weren't allowed anywhere near the eagles. In fact, I made a concerted effort to make sure that the eagles and the dogs really didn't even see each other. The dogs were too clueless, but I was afraid that the eagles would see the dogs, and then they would get, not that they would attack them, but that they would get used to them. What I didn't want to have happen is for the eagles to see a dog in someone's yard and think, oh yeah, I know, that's a dog, I'm not afraid of him. So I was very careful. When I would have to go and track the eagles, I'd put the dogs in my Jeep, and they'd have to stay there until I got back. Yeah, that's a great question, though.
I also was curious, like, it seemed like there were a number of skills you had to be learning on the fly, like the whole fishing setup that you put together. But how much of it did you feel like you brought into the field knowing what to do, and how much of it did you have to essentially improvise as you were going along?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it was improvisation. If you need to do something, you have to figure out a good way to do it. And one example was having to kill the fish. I've never been a fisherman because I don't like killing the fish. And so all of a sudden, I'm now faced having to kill a lot of fish. And I have no choice, or the eagles won't eat. So how could I develop a technique that was fast and quick, and I could do it, and I could do it a lot? And so I improvised. And I don't even want to go into the details. If you want to read about it, it's in the book, but it was pretty good, and it worked for me. But those were all things that had to go through my mind every time something was new. How do I climb this tower when I'm afraid of heights? How do I do this when I'm afraid of that? So it was constantly this sort of, push-pull kind of thing going on in my head. I knew what the goal was. I had to keep these birds alive. And so it was everything I could do just to get there. So yeah, improvisation is a wonderful thing.
And if that sort of combination of factors hadn't come together for, that you were there to take on that project, is your sense that that would not have happened that summer?
It wouldn't have happened at that time, no, because there wasn't anybody else that was willing to do it, and Tom Cade wasn't going to support anybody else. So it might have happened later on, but it wouldn't have happened before 1976. So it wouldn't have been such a big deal with the bicentennial if we hadn't done it then. And also, the federal government wanted to spend the money on the project because of the bicentennial. That money might have not have been as available if it had been later on. But everything just came together. It was just one of those crazy things that I met the people at the right time and that they wanted to do it, and it all just worked. We didn't know that the project was going to work, but we knew that it could at least get started and we could give it a try. So, yeah,
Of course, with none of the resources that we have now
right.
for tracking you or for tracking the eagles.
Well, the
and-
technology it would have been a very different situation. Yeah, even a cell phone would have been nice.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So did you have to do anything special to feed them? I know I've seen pictures where they have a mock, of some of the hacking, I don't know if it's peregrines, where they present the food with an image of the parents so that the young bird doesn't get, we'll associate that with what they're eating, or the providing of the food. When you presented it with food, did you have
How
it?
did I do it? Well, I was in the blind, and I had this long barbecue fork, and I put the fish or whatever it was on the end of the fork, and there was a hole about this big, and I would push it through. So all the eagles saw was the fork. They never saw me. They saw me below the platform. They could see me walking around down there, but they didn't associate me with the food that they were getting coming over the lip of their nest. So they didn't have any idea where that food was going to come from or what it was going to be. There was always a surprise because it was whatever I could find on the side of the road. If there were no fish, I had to improvise again with the prey items. But that's how I basically fed them. So I didn't have to do anything for them. They were old enough also. Remember that when I got them, they were 8 weeks old. And so they were old enough to pick at the food themselves. They didn't need the parents pulling at the little pieces and putting, if you've done anything with the eagle can, you'll know how tiny those little pieces are for a hatchling. And I didn't have to do that because they were feathered out by the time I got them.
Was winter weather or winter-like weather a factor at any point in?
No.
Okay.
No, they arrived in June and they basically left the refuge. In 76, they left the refuge in October, and in 77, they left earlier than that. So no, we never had to worry about weather. I did have a few rainstorms, and those were more for my problem than their problem. They didn't care. They just sat there in their nest and the rain came pummeling down on top of them. The only thing I worried about was wind, if it was going to blow the blind away. That would have been an issue. Because I couldn't have gotten up there to feed them if they could have seen me. So, but it didn't happen. We did have a big windstorm and it was okay. So no, it wasn't a problem.
Yeah, how did they,
Let me just get the mic, just so for the recording.
so, since they didn't have parents raising them, how did they know how to hunt or feed their young? Or is that all instinct, or is that something
Well,
learned, or?
We didn't know. And that was one of the questions. Are they going to be able to find their own food? And I honestly didn't know until they did, because no one had ever done this before. And so we didn't really know whether it's always taught by the parents or whether there's something instinctive about finding food when you're a raptor. And as it turns out, it is instinctive, and they didn't need the parents to show them. But the first time one of my eagles found a fish, it was a big moment of celebration because it meant two things. It meant, first of all, it is instinct. I didn't show him where the fish was. I didn't show him how to catch it. He figured it out on his own. And the other thing was he could survive on his own. So once he left the refuge, which we knew they were going to do eventually, he was going to be able to find his own food. And that was our big concern, is that we go through all of this, we keep them alive, but then when they left the refuge, that would be it. They wouldn't be able to sustain it. So I kept food on the tower for a long time after I thought they were gone, because I kept thinking, well, if they're really hungry and they can't find their own food, maybe they'll come back. And it turned out that once they left, they never came back. So, yeah.
Excuse me, my question is, probably 5 times over the last 10 to 20 years, traveling in Maine, in the fall, I think I'm seeing a golden eagle. And from what you're telling me, these fledglings, when do they get the white coloring?
They don't get the white head and tail, the pure white head and tail, until they're 5. But at 4, they're starting to get pretty white. They're just look a little dingy. So if you look at a 4-year-old bald eagle, he'll have a white head and tail, but it will look a little bit grayish. It's not that bright white. So that's the place where they start to breed, 4 to 5 years old.
And so a 2 or 3-year-old would be about the same as a mature adult?
No, 2 or 3, you mean size-wise or
Yeah,
the plumage?
size-wise.
Size-wise, they are the same, yes. Yeah, there's no difference between the immatures and the adults in terms of size. In fact, some people think that the immatures are bigger, but it may be that they're getting food from the parents, and so they're not having to expend as much energy to get their own food. These are wild birds, not my birds. But if they're wild, they're basically being supported by the parents so for quite a while. So they may be a bit bigger or heavier than the adult birds, but basically they're the same size.
And since I'm uninitiated on this stuff, the people in the room who are club members, are there golden eagles in New England?
There are, yes. I mean, you guys, the ECOC members, probably know more than I do about how many have been seen in New England.
They migrate through. They don't breed here, but it's always exciting when we do get a sighting, but they do come through every year in very small numbers. So what you're seeing up in Maine are almost certainly bald eagles.
You want to just summarize that?
I'll say that again. Yeah, there are golden eagles that breed up in Canada and in the east, and they migrate through every year in very small numbers. So if you're seeing what looks like a golden eagle, the probability is very high that it's a young bald eagle, actually.
Your eagles you said they left the refuge. Is there an instinct for them to migrate somewhere?
Well, eagles don't really migrate in the way you think, like ducks or geese. They move. And so their instinct is to go and find food. And they probably left the refuge because they thought there might be better picking somewhere else. That was probably the motivation. The first 2 birds, the 1976 birds, I'm almost positive left because the hunters ended up in the marsh. And they saw these people walking around. Remember, they hadn't seen much of me, so they really weren't used to people. And suddenly there are men walking around. I think that they left because of the hunters, because they left the next day. It was just too coincidental that they would have picked that time. But the other birds in 77 left before hunting season started. So, but they just moved. They don't, and the reason they come down to the Merrimack River, for example, is they're looking for open water. And where they're from, which probably is maybe in Canada, maybe in Maine, there's probably frozen. And so they're going to keep coming down until they find open water, and they'll congregate where the fish are. And that's why you'll see them in groups along the Hudson, along the Merrimack, and in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
One more question, maybe?
Hi, I followed the Jackie and Shadow that you were talking about the eagles from Big Bear. And how long do parents have to take care of and feed the babies like you had to feed them? How old are they when they don't really need that parent taking care of them anymore?
They usually fledge around 12 weeks, so those parents will probably be stuck in that nest for a while. They're going to have to keep those babies, particularly until they're feathered out. They're going to have to keep them warm. So you'll find them sitting on them a lot because they don't have any feathers. Once they start getting their feathers, which is usually around 6 weeks, well, they're pretty feathered out by 6, 7 weeks. then the birds will, the pair will stay away from the nest more and more. They'll come in, they'll drop the food, but they're not going to hang around with the young. They're going to feed them, and then they're going to wait until they either fall out of the nest or hopefully they make their first flight to a perch. That's ideal. If they can fly to a perch, then they're safe. They're above the ground, and they can stay there, and they will hop from perch to perch to perch as they're developing their wings. They have to get those wing muscles strong because they're such a big bird, and the wings are so big that they have to really be able to get lift. And so if they can do that, then they can be on their own. Then the parents will watch them. They always know where they are, and they'll watch to make sure that they're not in trouble, but they also will keep dropping food for them because those birds aren't ready to find their food yet. And that will usually go on until maybe 14 weeks, 12, 14 weeks, something like that. And then they'll start to hunt for themselves. But the parents will stay with them for a long time.
So, like the pairs that keep going back to the same nests and have different babies, do their babies ever come back?
No.
No,
No,
they just go off on their own
no,
and
they
make their
don't.
own life.
They don't come back, the babies don't come back to the same nest because the parents will come back to the same nest. Some nests have been going on for 20, 25 years. As in the case of M3, for example, 35 years in the same nest with two different mates. He went through two mates. One died, he found another one. But no, the babies will find other nests somewhere else. But remember, they're not going to be mature enough to breed until they're 4 or 5 years old. So during those 4 or 5 years, they're just wandering. So if you see immature eagles just kind of around, that's what they're doing. They're wandering. They're learning how to find food. They're learning about each other. They're learning about the area. They're trying to figure out what to do until they reach the white head and the white tail is the sign. When they reach that breeding age, they're going to try to find a mate and then build their own nest. Sometimes it's in the area, but not necessarily.
Thank you.
Well, Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I know there were still some pre-signed copies out there, but Tina will be coming out to sign more copies or to personalize, and that will also be the chance to talk to her. But I'm just going to ask that you let her get up there before asking her questions. Thanks again.